Katrina stood in front of Buckingham Palace, feeling unquestionable. High heels, a brand new dress with a famous brand's logo on it, and no desire to stand in line with all those tourists. She decided, I am the one who is more important than anyone else. There was not a single barrier between her and the guardsmen marching to their next position. And when one of them approached her, she did not even think to move. They will pass me, she thought, standing like a statue and laughing to herself. But the guard did not stop. He kept walking, his boots coming closer to her feet. At first, she didn't realize what was happening. But then, he just pushed her. Quietly, without any words, but with such force that she almost lost her balance and almost fell on the stone pavement. And here, in the silence, she realized, this was not just a guard. This is a military man who has no intention of giving in. And now she would have to understand why her irresponsibility had such a result. Katrina didn't even notice how she found herself on the way to the guardsmen. She had only one thing on her mind: to take a photo in front of Buckingham Palace to show everyone how she combined style and importance. But all those tourists standing in line seemed to her to be just limited people who wasted their time on such trifles. She felt that she didn't belong among them, that she was more important. She had her phone in her hand and took turns looking at herself in the frame, occasionally glancing at the people nervously waiting for their turn. Well, when will these guardsmen pass? Oh, they're going to pass me anyway, Katrina thought as she stood in the middle of the road. Her tall posture and steadfast confidence did not allow her to guess that she was the one who would have to change her behavior. All other people were giving way, and only she stood there laughing to herself. It was her moment, her privilege, and everything seemed to be as she was used to: control, style, importance. It seemed to her that this tiny change in the line was just an insignificant detail in her big and bright world. But this moment of self-confidence was the end of her illusions. As the first guard approached her, his gaze was cold, professional, and unwavering. She smiled, still expecting him to pass her, as all the others had always done. But he didn't. His boots clicking on the cobblestones became clear and uncompromising. Katrina did not realize what was happening at first. It was only when she saw his feet coming closer and closer to hers that her self-assured posture began to falter. She did not move, believing that he would be forced to overtake her. But he didn't. He simply did not stop. And when his boot hit her foot, Katrina felt as if a cold and irreversible force had pierced her entire body. It wasn't a kick, but his movement, clear, decisive, forced her to move away, and she almost fell to the pavement. It didn't make sense in her head. This couldn't be happening. She looked up and saw that the guard did not even look at her. His gaze remained in front of him, as if she were just an unnecessary part of the landscape. And at that moment, Katrina realized that there are things in this world that cannot be dictated to. And the guardsmen were one of them. She didn't lose it right away. Katrina's gaze became more determined. She picked up the phone and addressed the guardsman. Can't you see him standing here? I am a tourist. I also have something to show. Her voice grew louder and louder, and she could hear the neighboring tourists looking around curiously. But no one paid attention to her words. It was just a circumstance. And suddenly Katrina realized that there was nothing important in her words. The guardsman did not even hint at stopping. His hands were firmly clasped to his weapon, and his steps were precise and rhythmic. He walked as if not seeing her, as if not hearing her. Although rage was boiling in her eyes, she could not change the situation. He walked on, and she stood there, completely powerless before his discipline. All her previous attempts to make him stop seemed pathetic and insignificant now. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and the other tourists began to move away from her, whistling a little and whispering to themselves. One more step, and it was going to end in something she could not even foresee. Then it was only a matter of time. What to do with this uncompromising reality where her rights did not matter? What to do when the greatness and power of tradition become heavier than any self-confidence? Katrina stood there, still in disbelief that this was happening. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her mind could not accept the obvious. This situation was not decided by her desires, but by the unshakable rules and traditions she had ignored. The guardsman did not stop, and his rhythmic footsteps as he approached created a sound wave that seemed to drive her out of her own space. She smiled, trying to maintain her confidence, but it was no longer that easy. As she tried to regain her balance and take a step back, one of the men standing next to her approached her. He was an older veteran, wearing medals from various campaigns. He looked at her with an understanding and seriousness that only confirmed his experience. "You'd better move away," he said, not raising his voice, but his words were stern. Katrina shrugged her shoulders and turned away. "I'm not leaving. It's my right," she said, throwing off any attention to what had just happened. She was furious, but her decision remained unchanged, to stand where she was comfortable. But not only her husband reacted to her refusal, but also other people who had already noticed the situation. All these tourists stood there, silently watching her confrontation with one of Britain's most powerful symbols. The tourists began to retreat, all but Katrina, making room for the guardsmen who were gradually approaching. No one could understand why she would not just step aside. It was obvious to everyone. The guardsmen would not stop. They were following their own line, and they would not change their path for the sake of anyone's whims. The veteran looked at Katrina with an expression that immediately read her self-confident attitude and repeated, "They don't stop, believe me." But she only hummed in response, her eyes remaining focused on her phone, where she was trying to take the perfect photo, ignoring all warnings. The first sounds of the drums came from far away, and the guardsmen had already appeared on the horizon, their footsteps filling the square with the sound of stubbornness and discipline. With each step, their pace became more distinct, and their red uniforms looked brighter against the gray stones of Buckingham Palace. For most people, it was just another cultural event, another photo opportunity. For her, it was the last test of her stubbornness. And so, when one of the guardsmen approached her, his calm gaze and lack of emotion came as a shock to Katrina. She couldn't understand why he didn't pass her, why she couldn't stay in her seat. But when his shoe hit her feet with a soft, clear sound, she was pushed forward, and everything she was holding flew to the pavement. The laughter she had heard only seconds before fell silent, and her face was not the least bit confident. She looked up and caught the same guardsman's eyes again. He was not shocked, not in doubt. His gaze did not linger on her, did not wait for an apology or a reaction. He did not care. He was there to fulfill his mission. Katrina stood up from her knees, her hand clutching her phone, and her inner rage was no longer just at the person who had pushed her, but at the whole world that was trying to make her back down. She looked up at the other people and saw only indifference. All she could do was stand there, staring furiously at the soldier marching through her as if she were just part of the scenery. And although Katrina was not ready to accept it, the world around her made her realize that there is a place where the rules really do not change and discipline is not negotiable. And this place seemed to be in front of her. Katrina felt her heart grow heavy and every cell in her body protest. She raised her hand, trying to rake her belongings off the pavement, but her movements became sluggish. People around her began to whisper quietly, filming everything on their cameras, and tourists backed away, watching her fail. She picked up her phone and squeezed it to take at least one last shot, but her hands were shaking. The picture was no longer so appealing, and all her attempts to pretend that this was a normal situation crumbled to dust. Finally, when she got to her feet, her eyes fell on the guardsman. He was already far away, but she knew she would never see his face again, his emotionless gaze that didn't care even after she was pushed and her expensive belongings flew in all directions. "You have no right to do this to me," she exclaimed, shaking her head, her voice rising in anger. People didn't pay much attention to her, and this finally threw her off balance. She looked around the crowd and loudly declared, "I have every right to demand justice." It seemed that a little more and she would burst into tears on the spot, realizing that her position was not as strong as she thought. But then, unexpectedly, she was approached by a palace guard, a man with a serious look on his face. There was no condemnation in his eyes, only cold, ruthless professionalism. "You are interfering with the duties of the royal guard. We have warned you several times," he said, as if this were a normal workflow and not some kind of conflict. "What do you want from me?" she exclaimed. Her voice betrayed desperation. All her advantages that she loved so much became empty at once. She looked down at her torn clothes and felt the ground beneath her feet become even more unapproachable. "Your refusal to step back has had consequences," the guard continued, as if not noticing her emotions. "You ignored not only our warnings, but also the law. You were preventing the military from fulfilling their duties. It's not just disrespectful, it's an offense." Katrina felt her skin bead up with sweat droplets. She turned to him, trying to find something in his words that would allow her to avoid this moment. "We're not in the army. This is just Buckingham Palace," she burst out. But the guard did not respond to her objections. He looked away and nodded at two policemen standing nearby. They were approaching her with the same calm expression as the guard who had forced her to back away. "I didn't do anything wrong." Her voice was already high, and her despair began to roll in again. But there was only silence in response. At one point, when she began to demand that her case be considered through the media, the police really paid attention to her behavior for the first time. They came closer. One of them took a notebook out of his pocket and started writing down her name, and the other asked, "We have several pieces of evidence that you did not comply with the request to clear the way. Your actions impeded the normal passage of the guard." Incredible. Now she was not the one who was being listened to, but the one who was on the verge of responsibility. All that remained was her resentment, her desire to fight to the end, even if she no longer had the strength. The police gently explained to her that the incident would be investigated, but it was just a formality. The violation had become a fact, and she would soon have to answer for her actions. And just as things were finally starting to fall into place, the same veteran who had tried to warn her approached her. He looked at her with that look that only experience can give. "You missed a chance to understand what's important," he said, and without waiting for a response, he added, "Sometimes it is best to recognize that not everything can be bought." Katrina remained standing where she was, her arms still sore from the impact. She looked at the footage from her phone, where she had finally gotten her perfect photo, but it no longer had the same self-confidence. Her clothes were stained and her heart was cold with the realization that for the first time in her life she had become part of this irrevocable discipline. The guardsmen continued their service without looking back. They were fulfilling their mission, and in that moment Katrina realized that their determination, their dedication, was not just duty. It was a strength that needed no explanation. She had become part of something bigger, and that something was much stronger than her. And although she promised herself that it would never end, she knew in her heart that she would never look at the Royal Guard the same way again.